It is the evening of Saturday, August 4th, 1962. At a small Spanish-style house in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles, Marilyn Monroe goes to her bedroom at around 8 o'clock and closes the door. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, is staying the night. She moves around the house. She notices at some point past midnight that the light is still on under Monroe's bedroom door. She knocks. No answer. She tries the door. It is locked. She calls Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson. He drives the mile and a half to the house, arriving around 3:30 in the morning. Greenson looks through the bedroom window. He can see her lying in the bed. He breaks the window, climbs through, and finds her dead, lying face down, nude, one arm extended toward the telephone on the nightstand. Dozens of pill bottles are scattered on the bedside table. One of them, a prescription for 50 capsules of Nembutal filled just 2 days earlier, is empty. He calls her personal physician, Dr. Hyman Engelberg. Engelberg arrives at 3:50 and pronounces her dead. The Los Angeles Police Department is called at 4:25 in the morning. Between the moment Eunice Murray noticed the bedroom light on and the moment police were called, more than an hour passed. Between what some accounts suggest was the actual discovery of Monroe's body and the call to police, the gap may have been considerably longer. That gap, what happened inside it, who knew what and when, and what if anything was done or removed before the LAPD arrived, is the question at the center of the most debated celebrity death in American history. Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old. Her films had grossed the equivalent of $2 billion. 3 weeks before she died, she had been on the cover of Life magazine. The week she died, a photographer named Bert Stern was preparing to publish the final portrait session he had taken with her, a series of stunning images shot in late June. He called them The Last Sitting, and she died before she could see the images published. This is Hollywood Horrors, and this is the story of the woman who became the most famous person in the world, and what that world did with her. She was born Norma Jeane Mortensen on June 1st, 1926, at Los Angeles General Hospital in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. Her mother, Gladys Baker, was a film splicer at a movie laboratory, a woman who worked in the machinery of Hollywood dreams without ever being allowed to have them herself. Gladys suffered from psychiatric illness and was intermittently committed to institutions throughout her daughter's childhood. Norma Jeane's father was unknown. From the age of 7, Norma Jeane was passed between foster families and an orphanage. She later said that one of her earliest memories was of her mother trying to smother her in her crib with a pillow. As a child, she was sexually assaulted on multiple occasions in the homes where she was placed. She attended the cinema regularly. Her mother would sometimes leave her there for the day. And she dreamed, with the particular intensity of a child who has very little else to hold on to, of being a movie star. She dropped out of high school at 16. Her foster family was moving away and could not take her. She had 2 choices: return to the orphanage or marry. She married her 21-year-old neighbor, James Doherty, on June 19th, 1942. She was 16 years old. She loved him, according to those who knew them. He joined the Merchant Marines and shipped out to the South Pacific. She went to work on an assembly line at a munitions factory in Burbank. A photographer noticed her there in 1944 and began sending her modeling work. The camera, it turned out, did something for Norma Jeane Mortensen that nothing else had. It made her feel safe. She was, according to the owner of the modeling agency that eventually signed her, one of the most ambitious and hard-working models the agency had ever seen. By 1946, she had appeared on 33 magazine covers. In August of 1946, she signed her first contract with 20th Century Fox. She earned $125 a week. She dyed her naturally brown hair platinum blonde. She took a new name, Marilyn, suggested by a studio executive after the Broadway star Marilyn Miller, and Monroe, her mother's maiden name. She divorced James Doherty the same year. Norma Jeane Mortensen ceased to exist. Marilyn Monroe was born. The rise that followed is one of the most remarkable in the history of Hollywood. Remarkable partly for its speed, partly for the intelligence that drove it, and partly because it happened despite, and in some ways because of, the system's consistent underestimation of the woman at the center of it. She appeared in minor roles until 1950, when John Huston's The Asphalt Jungle gave her a small but memorable part that generated an enormous volume of fan mail. All About Eve followed the same year. By the early 1950s, she was a genuine star. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, There's No Business Like Show Business. She was the most photographed woman in the world and perhaps the most desired. She was also, consistently, one of the most underestimated. She knew it. In 1955, she left Hollywood for New York, enrolled in the Actors Studio, and studied under Lee Strasberg. She formed her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, and used it to renegotiate her contract with Fox on better terms. She made Bus Stop, which critics who had dismissed her as a comedic prop were forced to acknowledge as a serious dramatic performance. She made Some Like It Hot, for which she won a Golden Globe. She made The Misfits, which her then-husband, the playwright Arthur Miller, had written specifically for her. She married Joe DiMaggio in 1954. 9 months later, she divorced him. She married Arthur Miller in 1956. They divorced in January 1961, the same month that The Misfits was released. By the spring of 1962, she was alone, under the care of a psychiatrist, dependent on barbiturates and sleeping pills, and in the middle of a film, Something's Got to Give, for 20th Century Fox, from which she was fired in June for absenteeism, the studio attributed to substance abuse. But she had also just been named World Film Favorite at the Golden Globe Awards. She had just been rehired by Fox after negotiations. She had recently purchased her first home, the house on 5th Helena Drive in Brentwood, which she had bought for $75,000 and was in the process of furnishing. She had appointments scheduled for August 5th. She was planning a biopic of Jean Harlow, she told Life magazine in a July interview. I hope to ultimately be able, through my work, to illuminate for some people some things I've learned. Maybe it's just a dream, but I'm also entitled to my dreams. That interview was published 2 days before she died. No account of the death of Marilyn Monroe is complete without the Kennedys, and no account of the Kennedys in relation to Marilyn Monroe is entirely clean. What we know with reasonable confidence is this: Marilyn Monroe had a relationship of some kind with President John F. Kennedy. The nature of that relationship, its depth, its duration, how seriously Monroe regarded it, has been disputed by biographers for 6 decades. What is not seriously disputed is that they were intimate at some point during his presidency, and that the relationship was largely conducted out of his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford's beach house in Malibu. Kennedy would visit his brother-in-law, and the Rat Pack would throw parties there that served as convenient cover. On May 19th, 1962, less than 3 months before her death, Marilyn Monroe appeared at a Democratic fundraiser and birthday celebration for President Kennedy at Madison Square Garden in New York. She wore a beige, skin-tight dress, covered in rhinestones, sewn so tightly onto her body that she had to be lifted into it. She sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" in a breathy, charged rendition that the crowd of 15,000 people understood immediately for what it was. The president, when he took the stage afterward, smiled and said she had sung "Happy Birthday" in a way he could retire from politics after her doing that. It was one of the most watched moments of either of their careers. Within weeks of that performance, according to multiple accounts and the research of biographer Anthony Summers, who spent 3 years conducting 650 tape-recorded interviews for his 1985 book, Goddess: The Secret Lives of Marilyn Monroe. Robert Kennedy contacted Monroe and told her not to call either himself or the president again. The relationship, whatever it had been, was over. Monroe's friend Arthur James told Summers, "She was terribly hurt when she was told directly never to call or contact Robert or John again. Jack didn't contact her, Bobby did, and that's what killed her." The use of "killed her" here is figurative. James was describing the emotional devastation of the rejection, not a physical act. But the phrase has echoed through the conspiracy literature for 4 decades in ways that James almost certainly did not intend. What the record does show is that Monroe, in the final weeks of her life, was emotionally destabilized. She was making calls to the White House switchboard that were not being returned. By all accounts, she was struggling with the combined weight of professional setbacks, personal isolation, the end of her 3rd marriage, the end of a relationship with one of the most powerful men in the world, and the chronic substance dependence that had been woven through her adult life for years. She was also, in that same period, being surveilled. The Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa, who had helped build political support for JFK's election, but was now being aggressively pursued by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, had hired a private investigator named Fred Otash to dig up compromising material on the Kennedy brothers. Otash, according to accounts that emerged years later, bugged the homes of both Peter Lawford and Marilyn Monroe. Robert Kennedy was in Los Angeles on August 4th, 1962, the day Monroe died. Whether he visited her that day is one of the contested facts at the center of the case. 2 decades after Monroe's death, Eunice Murray told a BBC documentary crew that Robert Kennedy had in fact visited Monroe on the evening of August 4th, and that they had quarreled. Murray's credibility is complicated. She changed her account of the evening's timeline multiple times over the years, and different statements she gave at different points are inconsistent with each other in significant ways. But the BBC documentary crew noted that she appeared to make the admission about Kennedy's visit without realizing she was still being recorded. The 1982 review of Monroe's death by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, conducted in response to persistent public pressure, found no credible evidence of homicide or conspiracy. The review concluded that killing Marilyn Monroe would have required what it called a massive, in-place conspiracy, and that no evidence of such a conspiracy had been found. The official verdict remained probable suicide. The report did, however, concede that factual discrepancies and unanswered questions remained. Let us walk through what we know about the last day of Marilyn Monroe's life and what the evidence, as it exists, actually tells us. On the morning of August 4th, Monroe was described by her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, as pale and tired when she came into the kitchen at around 9 in the morning. She had spent the night before with her longtime publicist, Pat Newcomb, who had slept over. Monroe's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, conducted a therapy session with her in the late afternoon, from approximately 4:30 to 5:30. Greenson later said that after the session, Monroe seemed to be in reasonable spirits. He told her to take a drive to the beach for some fresh air. He left believing she was calmer than she had been earlier in the day. At around 7 in the evening, Joe DiMaggio's son, Joe DiMaggio Jr., called Monroe and told her that he had ended his engagement with his fiancée. Monroe spoke with him warmly. By multiple accounts, she seemed in better spirits after that call. Greenson called her again after his session to check in. He spoke with her briefly. He believed she was better. Murray last saw Monroe alive at around 8 in the evening, when Monroe went to her bedroom and closed the door. What happened between 8 in the evening on August 4th and 3:30 in the morning on August 5th, when Murray raised the alarm, has never been fully established. The official timeline, as reported in the initial investigation, placed the discovery of Monroe's body at around 3 in the morning on August 5th. Murray said she woke with an uneasy feeling, saw the light under the bedroom door, could not get a response, and called Greenson. But there are significant inconsistencies in this timeline, and they have never been resolved. First, the state of Monroe's body. The undertaker who collected her body noted that she appeared to be in advanced rigor mortis. Rigor mortis is the post-mortem stiffening of the muscles that typically begins 2 to 6 hours after death and is fully developed within 12 hours. If Monroe was in advanced rigor mortis when she was found at 3:30 in the morning, this would suggest she had died considerably earlier, potentially as early as 7 or 8 in the evening, not in the middle of the night. Second, the accounts of the first officer on the scene. Sergeant Jack Clemens of the LAPD, who was the first police officer to arrive after the call at 4:25 in the morning, later told a BBC documentary that when he arrived, Eunice Murray, Greenson, and Engelberg all told him that Monroe had been found dead 4 hours earlier, around midnight. Clemens also stated that he found Murray washing Monroe's bed sheets when he arrived, which, if accurate, would mean evidence was being actively destroyed. Clemens later acknowledged, however, that he did not mention the sheet washing in his initial police report, undermining the credibility of the claim as a contemporaneous account rather than a recollection developed decades later. Third, Murray's changing stories. Over the course of more than 2 decades of interviews, Eunice Murray gave meaningfully different accounts of when she discovered Monroe was unresponsive and when she called Greenson. In 1985, during a BBC documentary interview, not knowing a microphone was still running, she appeared to indicate that Greenson had arrived and found Monroe still alive. She later denied having said this. The BBC recording exists. What precisely she meant and whether it reflects an actual sequence of events or a slip of an aging woman's memory cannot be established. Fourth, the ambulance question. Some accounts, including testimony from an ambulance worker, suggest that a Schaefer Ambulance Company vehicle was called to Monroe's house earlier in the evening of August 4th, and that Monroe may have been alive or recently deceased when it arrived. The owner of Schaefer Ambulance denied his company was at the house at all. This claim has never been definitively resolved. What we can say with confidence is this: the timeline of Monroe's death was not cleanly established, the people present that night gave inconsistent accounts, and the police were called at 4:25 in the morning, which, depending on when Monroe actually died, represents a delay of anywhere from less than an hour to several hours. The reason for any such delay, if there was one, has never been satisfactorily explained. The autopsy of Marilyn Monroe was performed on August 5th, 1962 by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, then one of the newest deputy coroners in Los Angeles County. Noguchi is not an obscure figure. He would go on to become the chief medical examiner of Los Angeles County, a position he held for many years. And he performed the autopsies of some of the most famous people in American history: Robert F. Kennedy, Sharon Tate, Janis Joplin, John Belushi, Natalie Wood. He became known as the coroner to the stars, and his career was one of the most distinguished in the history of American forensic medicine. In August of 1962, he was 29 years old and had been assigned, somewhat unusually, to perform the autopsy of the most famous woman in the world. The chief medical examiner typically handled high-profile cases himself. For reasons that have never been explained, he did not handle this one. What Noguchi found was the following. Monroe's blood showed lethal levels of pentobarbital, the active ingredient in Nembutal, and chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative. The liver showed 13 milligrams percent of pentobarbital. The blood showed 8 milligrams percent of chloral hydrate. These were, in the words of the toxicologist who analyzed them, fatal levels, enough to kill, as some accounts put it, several people. Noguchi ruled the cause of death as acute barbiturate poisoning. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Theodore Curfey, held a press conference and announced, "It is my conclusion that the death of Marilyn Monroe was caused by a self-administered, an overdose of sedative drugs, and that the mode of death is probable suicide." But Noguchi had found something during the autopsy that troubled him, something he requested further testing on, something that was taken away from him before the testing could be done. In 2025, at the age of 99, Thomas Noguchi broke a 6-decade silence in the book L.A. Coroner, Thomas Noguchi and Death in Hollywood by historian An-Soon Choi. What he said has reopened questions that Los Angeles officially closed in 1962. When Noguchi made his incision and examined Monroe's stomach and small intestine, he found no visual evidence of pills. There was a milky substance in the stomach. There were no pill residues. There was no yellow dye. Nembutal capsules were coated in a yellow dye that, in normal digestion, would leave traces in the stomach lining. There was none. Noguchi wanted to run further tests on the stomach contents and the other organs. He collected samples of the blood, urine, liver, kidneys, stomach and its contents, and intestines. He submitted them for full toxicology analysis. The head toxicologist, Raymond Abernathy, found the fatal drug levels in the blood and liver and made a decision. The levels were fatal, the death was clearly caused by barbiturate poisoning, and no further testing was necessary. He disposed of the organ samples. Noguchi, who had specifically requested the additional testing, learned that the organs had been discarded after the fact. He described to Choi what happened, and when he realized, a wave of anxiety washed over him. He knew that not running the additional tests would become a problem. It left too many questions unanswered. The question those tests would have answered: how did lethal levels of barbiturates get into Monroe's bloodstream and liver without leaving any detectable trace in her stomach or intestines? The most straightforward explanation for the absence of pill residue in the stomach is that Monroe, a habitual user of sleeping pills for many years, had simply metabolized what she had taken rapidly, before death. Noguchi himself, in the same interview, stated that he now believes Monroe's death was suicide. He noted that a habitual pill user would have metabolized the drugs more efficiently than an occasional user, reducing the likelihood of visible residue. But he also acknowledged with the precision of a forensic scientist who spent a career insisting on completeness, that without the organ analysis, it was impossible to rule out that the drugs had been administered by a route other than oral ingestion. A suppository or enema, for example, would produce lethal blood levels without leaving pill residue in the stomach. The organs that would have answered that question were disposed of before they were tested. They cannot be recovered. They cannot be retested. The question will remain permanently open. After 6 decades of investigation, journalism, books, documentaries, and the 2022 Netflix documentary, The Mystery of Marilyn Monroe, The Unheard Tapes, which drew on Anthony Summers' 650 recorded interviews, 3 theories for Monroe's death have emerged as the primary frameworks. Let us examine each honestly. Theory 1, suicide. This is the official verdict, supported by 2 formal investigations, in 1962 and in 1982, and by the coroner who performed the autopsy. The supporting evidence is substantial. Monroe had a documented history of depression, anxiety, and previous suicide attempts. She was dependent on barbiturates. She had recently experienced a cascade of professional and personal setbacks. She was fired from her film, professionally sued by the studio, the end of a relationship with a president, rejection by both Kennedy brothers, the dissolution of her 3rd marriage. She was in psychiatric treatment. Her doctors knew she was fragile. The empty Nembutal bottle, prescription filled just 2 days earlier, contained 50 capsules. Her blood levels were consistent with having taken a large dose of both Nembutal and chloral hydrate. The psychiatric evaluation conducted alongside the autopsy, a psychological autopsy, found that Monroe showed, in the language of the report, psychiatric disturbance, severe fears, and frequent depressions. The 1982 District Attorney's review concluded that the evidence supported either suicide or accidental overdose, and that no credible evidence of homicide existed. Theory 2, accidental overdose. This theory holds that Monroe's death was not intentional, but was the result of a catastrophic accidental combination of drugs, specifically that her psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, and her physician, Dr. Engelberg, had, without coordinating with each other, prescribed overlapping medications that interacted fatally. Greenson was attempting to wean Monroe off Nembutal, which she had been heavily dependent on. Engelberg, not fully aware of what Greenson was managing, filled a fresh prescription for 50 Nembutal capsules just 2 days before her death. Monroe, in the grip of the anxiety and insomnia that had plagued her for years, may have taken both her Nembutal and her chloral hydrate, medications that are individually dangerous and potentially fatal in combination, without understanding how much she had taken or what the interaction would produce. This theory is consistent with the toxicological findings and with the absence of a suicide note. Monroe had appointments scheduled for August 5th. She had plans. She had a contract with Fox. These details argue against intentional self-destruction. Theory 3. Murder. The murder theory has taken many forms over 6 decades. The most prominent version involves the Kennedys, that Monroe had become a liability to the administration, that she had information about the Kennedys or about government secrets that made her dangerous, and that someone in their circle arranged or carried out her death. The evidentiary support for this theory is thin. The 1982 DA's review found that any Kennedy-connected murder would have required a massive, coordinated conspiracy involving multiple people, and found no credible evidence of one. The coroner's original autopsy is consistent with drug poisoning. There are no surviving witnesses who have credibly placed an unknown assailant at Monroe's house that night. What the theory feeds on is the accumulated weight of the anomalies, the timeline gaps, Murray's changing stories, the delayed call to police, the organ samples that were destroyed before full testing, the state of rigor mortis that suggested an earlier time of death than the official account, and the fact that Robert Kennedy was in Los Angeles that day, and that his visit, if it occurred, was never part of the official investigation. None of these anomalies, individually or collectively, constitute evidence of murder. They constitute evidence of a poorly managed investigation, inconsistent witness accounts, and an autopsy process that was truncated before it was complete. Poor investigation is not the same as cover-up. Inconsistent recollections are not the same as conspiracy. The 1982 DA's report put it plainly. Based on the available evidence, it appeared that Monroe's death could have been a suicide or the result of an accidental drug overdose. And what evidence the investigation had was incomplete. What we are left with is this. The most famous woman in the world died in her bedroom on a Saturday night in August, alone with the phone near her hand. The people closest to her that evening gave inconsistent accounts of what happened and when. The forensic evidence that might have answered the most important remaining question was destroyed before it was examined. And the official verdict, probable suicide, remains the most credible conclusion supported by the evidence that actually exists, while acknowledging that the evidence that exists is not complete. That is an uncomfortable place to stand, but it is the honest one. Marilyn Monroe was buried on August 8, 1962, in the Corridor of Memories at Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Joe DiMaggio, from whom she had been divorced for 8 years and to whom she had remained close, handled the arrangements. He excluded the Kennedys, the Rat Pack, and the Hollywood establishment from the funeral. It was a small private service. For the next 20 years, DiMaggio had red roses delivered to her crypt 3 times a week. He never remarried. When he died in 1999, his last words were reported to be, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." Her crypt at Westwood is one of the most visited in Los Angeles. People leave roses, lipstick kisses pressed to the marble, notes, photographs. The woman buried there, Norma Jeane Mortensen, who became Marilyn Monroe, who was trying at 36 to figure out what came next, has been reduced by history to the image: the blonde hair, the red lips, the dress over the subway grate, the breathless birthday song. She was smarter than that. She read voraciously. She was studying Chekhov. She had a library of 400 books. She co-founded her own production company at a time when female stars did not do that. She said, in that final Life magazine interview, 2 days before she died, "I've always had too much fantasy to be only a housewife. I think it was just a necessity for me to have something of my own." She was 36 years old. She had only begun to have something of her own. Thank you for listening to Hollywood Horrors. If this episode moved you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who deserves to know who Marilyn Monroe actually was. We will be back with another story from the dark side of the Dream Factory.